Well, good morning, everyone. We are now going into the rest of Hebrews, starting with Hebrews chapter 5, which is amazing because the author is transitioning into the high priesthood of Jesus. I was just thinking about it this morning. Many of us can say this truth, that Jesus died for my sin. And that is true. But exactly what goes on beneath that statement may be lost on many of us. In the same way, it's like I know how to drive a car, but I don't know what goes on under the hood. And what I know about that is very dangerous. But the author of Hebrews, as he's going to explain to us the high priesthood of Jesus, is we're going to get to know the intricacies of what's going on under the hood and going to have an appreciation for exactly how his high priesthood is dealing with your sin and with my sin. And so we would be able to say, he deals with my sin, but we will also know how. What exactly happened? How exactly did he deal with our sin? We'll get more into that in Hebrews chapter 7 to 10. But like Rochelle mentioned last week, the author is already just transitioning into high priesthood. And we're going to have a look at it in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1 to 10, specifically looking at Jesus' own priesthood, high priesthood, and what that means and how he came to function in that role. So before we start, let me just say this. Everybody in this room might have experienced it, but if you haven't, I can promise you, if you remain in the country long enough, you will experience it. It's like if you've ever been to your GP's office or to your surgery. Thank you so much. I almost said nursery. That wouldn't have been the right word. If you've ever been to your GP surgery and you explained to him what's wrong, and he looked at you and he said to you, you know what? I'm going to give you a referral letter to go and see a specialist or a consultant. That is the only way you're able to see a consultant. You cannot just walk in off the street, go into a consultant's room and say to him, well, can you see me, please? I've got an issue. I've got a problem. No, you have to go through the right channel, and the person with the right authority needs to give you a referral letter because that gives you access. That opens up a door into the specialist's office. And so I haven't demanded access to see a specialist, but it has been granted to me by a person who's able to make it happen. So I want you to think about just that dynamic. Because now all of a sudden, when I have a referral letter from my GP, all of a sudden, the doors are opening that were closed before, and the specialist who would never see me coming off from the street now has my file on his desk, and he says to me, Niku, how can I help you? How can I assist? So a person needs to have the right authority to look at my situation and also be able to do something about it. Now, when I go to the GP as well as to the consultant, I can't do anything to put myself forward to see a consultant. The GP needs to do that. So we have to understand, just by that natural example, in the same way, when we come before God, we cannot self-refer ourselves. We cannot do a self-referral. There needs to be somebody who's got the authority and who knows my position, who can actually open up access to God. And that person is Jesus. He is the only one that can do that. And really what separates me and you from the Lord is sin. It's a deep fracture within our relationship with the Lord that we are not able to overcome ourselves. We are not able to bridge the gap. We are not able to reconcile ourselves with Him. It's impossible. We cannot, in that sense, do a self-referral, and we cannot walk into His presence and present our case to Him. Somebody else needs to do it on your behalf and on my behalf. In a sense, you need someone who can write the letter for you. Someone close enough that truly understands your condition, but also somebody powerful enough who has the authority to do something about it. Because you can have a friend that's sitting right next to you that knows a lot about what you're going through, but he doesn't have the authority to do anything for you. He doesn't have anything he can do for you. So just if somebody knows your condition, but they don't have the authority, they can't do anything for you. You need both somebody who can look at your condition and have the authority and the power and the ability to do something about it. And also, we can't do anything about it ourselves. We can't. You can't do anything about your condition. I can't do anything about my condition. And so when we move into this passage, chapter 5, about the high priesthood of Jesus, we go all the way back to how God instituted and drew people together, Israel, and how he made the society function and what he put in place so that a sinful people can come close to a holy God. Or how a holy God is able to dwell in the midst of a sinful people. God made that happen in the Old Testament, and he has brought that into fulfillment through the person of Jesus. So let us read just an extended portion of Scripture, just to give us context. So Sam, if we can have the Scripture up there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to cover what Rochelle shared last week, and I'm going to read up until 5 verse 10. So from 4:14 to 5:10, but we're only going to focus on the first 4 verses of chapter 5. But we'll give you just a big picture of what is happening and what the author is trying to communicate. Like Rochelle mentioned last week, 4:14 to 16 are transitional verses. So the author is using it to transition into a new topic, which is going to be the high priesthood of Jesus. The high priesthood of Jesus. So let's read together from 4:14 to 5 verse 10. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So we're going to focus on 5 verse 1 to 4 today. And so the author uses this really just as a springboard into Jesus' own high priesthood. And so he's going to give the reader 4 qualifications that you must meet in order to stand in the function or the office of a high priest. If you don't qualify on these 4 levels, you cannot be a high priest. You're unable to be a high priest. And you need a high priest as the bridge between sinful people and a holy God. There is no other way to move between a sinful people and a holy God other than through the mediation of a high priest. That's the only way. And in order to be a high priest, you must qualify in 4 ways. So the author is going to show us what that looks like. So I'm going to jump into, there we go, thanks so much, Sam. Let's get into it. So the very first qualification that you do see here is human solidarity taken from among men. This is very important. So the very first qualification that a high priest must walk in or must have in order to qualify is he must be part of the people. So if you have an entire group of people here, the high priest must be part of this group of people. He must share in your humanity. He must share in my humanity. So he must, in a sense, be human. He cannot serve in the office as a high priest without being human in the same way that you're human and the same way that I'm human. And you see that in the Old Testament so clearly. A priest who is not genuinely human cannot genuinely represent, because representation requires real identification. Representation requires real identification. If a high priest cannot completely identify with those that he is representing, he cannot represent them adequately. So if he cannot identify with them completely, he cannot represent them adequately. The high priest was also not a superior being, but he was chosen from among Israel and elevated to a position of service. This is so important. You'll see that in the Old Testament as well. He was chosen from among God's people, and he was raised up in a position of service and elevated to a position of service to act on behalf of the people towards God. So when the people looked at him, they were able to say, he is one of us. He understands what we're going through. He understands our weaknesses. He understands our temptations. He understands how hard it is for us. And they will have confidence that he would be able to stand before God because he knows what it feels like to be them, because he is human. How many times have you had a conversation, even either verbalized it or just thought it like that in your own heart, when you're going through a difficult time and somebody wants to help? Your initial response is, you don't know what I'm going through. What you're actually saying is, you don't necessarily have anything of value to offer me because you do not know what I'm going through. It's a human response. That's why the high priest had to be human, so that nobody can say, well, you're representing me, but you really don't know what I'm going through. You really don't know what's confronting me. You really don't know, how difficult it is. But if the high priest is chosen from among men to represent men, then they cannot say that, because he is a human like they are. So how does this anticipate Jesus? The author has already made this point in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17, when he says Jesus had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he can be a merciful and faithful high priest. He can be a merciful and faithful high priest. The reason why Jesus became man was not so that we can have a face to look at, primarily. Not because of a sign of goodwill. Not because God can be more approachable. The reason why Jesus became man is because it is necessary if he were to be a high priest. Because those that he will be representing is humanity. And he has to share in everything that they are sharing in. So the first category, if you want to be a high priest, you must be chosen from among men. You must share their frame. And so Jesus could not, in a real sense, be a high priest without being human. He had to become human in order to be a high priest. Hence the incarnation. And not only in a certain respect, he had to share our humanity completely and fully. What we go through in our human experience and limitations and what it means to be human, Jesus had to experience that in its fullest extent. If you look at Jesus in his humanity, there must be nothing that can separate him from you. He cannot be less human than you are. He cannot be less human than I am. That's why the incarnation, so that he can serve in the capacity of a high priest. Okay, so the first qualification is human solidarity, chosen from among men. The second qualification, let me go there. Mediatorial function. He needs to be a mediator between the people and God. So you see here, he had to be appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. So the high priest's position is directional. He's chosen from among men, and he's pointed towards God, carrying the sin of the people in between those two parties. So he is a mediator. That is his role. So a high priest is not primarily a teacher, a preacher, or whatever the case might be. A high priest is, in a real sense, he is a bridge. He is a bridge between people and God, taking the sacrifice on behalf of people to God so that God can extend forgiveness to his people. That is the role of a high priest even in the Old Testament. So a high priest's entire position, his entire role is this: I'm chosen from among people towards God, and like I mentioned, carrying the sin of the people. The high priest exists at the intersection of holiness and need. God is a holy God. When we sin against him, we come under his wrath and his judgment. But a people that have sinned against God can do nothing from themselves to make that right. So they need his forgiveness, but they cannot pursue forgiveness by themselves. They need somebody else to do it on their behalf. Hence the high priest. The high priest, even in the Old Testament, is the only person that can mediate the holiness of the Lord and the sinfulness of man. And its climax happened at the Day of Atonement. Once a year, the high priest will go into the Holy of Holies, offer sacrifice unto God, so that he can cover the sin of his people. And he had to do that year on year on year on year. It's never a finished work. Continually, generation after generation, year after year. So all of this matters when we're going to look at Jesus' own high priesthood and how his own high priesthood and his own offering of himself is superior to the Old Testament sacrificial system. It's only when we understand the Old Testament sacrificial system that we're really going to have a deep appreciation for who Jesus is and what he did. So, people cannot approach God on their own terms. They need somebody who is appointed, authorized, and equipped to carry their case before him. If you look even at the Old Testament, whenever somebody tried to violate what God has put in place, judgment and death came as a result. When you look at the, what was the tribe's name? Korah's rebellion came up to Moses. Are we not also priests because we're of the tribe of Levi? Let's get together tomorrow. Let the Lord judge between the two of us. So what happened? The next day came. God brought judgment on them. The earth split open, sucked all of their men, and closed over them. And the fear of the Lord fell on the entire assembly. You had King Uzziah that wanted to burn incense in the temple that he was not allowed to do, and he thought because he was king, he can presume upon that position. So what happened? The Lord struck him with leprosy. You cannot approach God on your own terms. God says, this is the way it is, this is how you approach me, and if you're not going to honor that, there's going to be severe consequences. And so the only way that God has put in place in the Old Testament to approach him is through the high priest. It's through the high priest. So out of millions of people within Israel, only one person can come into the presence of God but once a year. And now you see how profound it is. Because of what Jesus has done, it's not just one person once a year. Because of what Christ has done, the access to God's presence is open to everyone, whenever you want to. That is how superior Jesus' own sacrifice is. Just think about how mind-blowing and explosive that idea is. In the Old Testament, doesn't matter how earnestly you want to be close to God, you cannot, because you are not the high priest. But Jesus' high priesthood now makes a way for every believer who puts their faith and trust in him and is part of the new covenant to access God's presence anytime, anywhere, uninterrupted. Okay, how does this anticipate Jesus? We will see that in chapter 7 to 10, the author will speak about Jesus' own high priesthood. And that actually the Aaronic priesthood, so Aaron was the first high priest, and then it became a hereditary position. So his descendants were then becoming high priests. So that was the order in which God established high priesthood. So that high priesthood in the Old Testament was actually only a shadow and a figure. Jesus' high priesthood is the substance of the shadow. So think about it in this way. I'm standing here on the stage. The Old Testament high priesthood system was like my shadow being cast here on the stage. Jesus' high priesthood is the substance of the shadow. The shadow indicates or directs you to what the substance actually is. If the substance was not here, there would be no shadow. And if you see a shadow, there must be a substance, because they go together, hand in hand. You cannot have a substance without a shadow. So the Old Testament sacrificial system and high priesthood system was the shadow. It was pointing always, it has been pointing forward to the actual substance, which is Jesus and his high priesthood. ultimately, always, everything has been pointing towards Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament shadow and figure. Okay. So then you begin to realize, doesn't matter what I read in the Old Testament, Jesus is always the destination. Whether it's the sacrificial system, whether it's the feasts that the Jews celebrated, everything is only but a shadow. Its final culmination and substance is the person of Jesus. Everything. Everything comes together in him. Everything finds its fullest understanding, expression, experience in him. Everything points towards him. Everything. Okay, qualification 3. Identification capacity. We read in chapter or verse 2 and 3 that a high priest must be able to deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because he also needs forgiveness, because he also understands his own frailty and his own need for God to extend grace to him, he's able to deal gently and kindly with those who need it as well. But here is the difference, and this is very important. Don't miss this. This is where Jesus diverges from the Old Testament high priesthood system or qualification, because he does not need a sacrifice for his own sin, because he's without sin. Remember, the high priest, when he goes into the Holy of Holies, he brings a sacrifice not only for the people's sin, but also for his own. Jesus does not have sin, so he does not need to bring an offering or a sacrifice for himself. And because he doesn't have to do that, we'll see later in Hebrews, it's amazing. He himself is the sacrifice. The high priest had to sacrifice a lamb, unblemished, less than 1 year old. He put his hand on the lamb to transfer the sins of the people onto the lamb. Then God's judgment would fall. Because Jesus does not have to pay for his own sin because he's without it, he can offer himself as a sacrifice. That's the difference. That's the difference. A high priest in the Old Testament is really a sinner interceding for sinners. And so the sacrifice that the high priest brought in the Old Testament, it was really incomplete, because it had to happen year after year after year. The high priests in the Old Testament, their compassion was genuine, but it was compromised, because they themselves had the same condition as the people. They themselves needed forgiveness as much as the people needed forgiveness. They stood with the people in that sense, not apart from them. So the high priest truly understands human failing, but he is caught inside that failing himself. His compassion is real, but his offering is complete. He cannot deal with your sin. The high priest couldn't deal with the sin of God's people without at the same time dealing with his own sin as well. And here is where Jesus' high priesthood is not only elevated, but it supersedes the high priesthood of the Old Testament, because although he can identify with us in every respect in terms of our humanity, he does so without sin. He is not morally liable in standing before God. He does not need to offer a sacrifice for himself. His compassion is uncorrupted. His offering is undivided. And the author here in Hebrews chapter 5 is very specific and careful to highlight this limitation in the Old Testament priesthood and when it comes to Jesus. So in Jesus, we have a high priest that does not suffer from the same condition we do. He doesn't suffer from the same condition. He does not need forgiveness of sin. We do. And then the very last qualification is divine appointment. So here is something that we really have to get. The high priesthood, even in the Old Testament, is an honor that cannot be seized. It can only be received. It's not like you have a coups in countries where you see somebody in power and you think, I'm going to take that power by force. High priesthood in the Old Testament, it was given by God. You cannot take it for yourself. It has to be extended and given by God. The high priest was divinely appointed. It is by God's own initiative that you find the high priesthood in the Old Testament. A self-appointed priest had no standing before God. His mediation would be presumption, not access, because God did not authorize it. What do you think if you presume to appear before King Charles? You just pitch up at Buckingham Palace, say, I want to see the king, please. Well, no. As easy as that. Because your access was not authorized. In the same way here, you can't just put yourself forward as a priest. That would be presumption on your part. Priesthood had to be sanctioned by God. Is God himself saying and communicating that this person, by my appointment, may approach me on your behalf? God puts those parameters in place. We have nothing to do with that. This qualification of divine appointment protects people as much as it honors God. Why? If anyone could appoint themselves as a mediator, the people would never know whose access to God was real. They would never know because it's self-appointed. Divine appointment is the guarantee of authenticity because everybody would know it was appointed by God himself. So you take these four things together. Oh, how does this anticipate Jesus? From chapter 5 to 10, we are going to see that Jesus' own high priesthood is not after the order of Aaron, but after the order of Melchizedek. And we'll look at that next week. But the Father himself appointed Jesus in his high priesthood role. Jesus did not take that position himself. He was appointed to high priesthood by the Father, satisfying the qualification of divine appointment. We'll have a look at that. So you take these four things together. In order to be a high priest, in order to be a mediator or a bridge between sinful people and God himself, you must be human, come from amongst people. You must serve in the capacity of carrying the people's sin before God. You also have to have that sense of identification that you can identify with them. And finally, there needs to be a divine appointment. God must appoint you. You cannot appoint yourself. So you draw all of those together. You see here in Jesus that he meets but also supersedes all four of these qualifications. He meets the human qualification fully, because he shares in your humanity, he shares in my humanity. He meets the functional qualification completely because he was able to deal with the sin that kept me and you separated from God. He meets the identification qualification wholly. And lastly, he meets the divine qualification permanently. Because we will see that unlike the priesthood under Aaron, where high priests grow old and they die, and the next generation of high priests need to step into that place, Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, meaning he is a priest forever. His priesthood never ceases. It never comes to an end. It never comes to an end. So he's always able to make intercession between a sinful people and a holy God. And that's where it diverges in terms of qualification. Jesus fulfills all 4 qualifications the Old Testament puts down, but he supersedes them as well. He's superior than all those qualifications. So, just a point of application. Just a point of application. Stop trying to be your own high priest. Let me explain what I mean by that. Nobody came in this morning and thought to themselves, I will earn my way to God by sheer effort. Nobody came in here this morning and said, in their mind, look, I'm going to do A, B, and C, and when I do A, B, and C, that will grant me access to God and His presence. It is much more subtler than that. So let me read for you. It's that nagging feeling that you need to get yourself into better spiritual shape before you can really approach God. Who's ever felt like that? I need to do more. I need to be better. And only when I do more, only when I do better, then I will feel more comfortable coming before God. But then it's based on my work and my merit. Okay. It's that exhausting cycle of sin, shame, and self-repair. Trying to fix myself before I bring myself before God. It shows up as the feeling that my access to God on any given day is proportional to how well I've been performing. If I've performed well, I have confidence to come into his presence. If I haven't performed well, the confidence is really low. But all of these situations, it's up to me. It's up to me. It's up to me. So what God really needs to deliver us from is the fact it's got nothing to do with you. It's got nothing to do with me. At all. And if we don't release these way of thinking, we are in effect trying to write our own referral letter. And you know what? Hebrews will not allow us to do that. Hebrews will not allow us to do that. When I was in doing my degree in college, we would go out to unis and we will just engage people and students and ask them, what do you believe? No, I'm a Christian. Okay, are you going to heaven? Yes. Why? It's like I'm a good person. I haven't done a lot of bad. Okay? That's the general response we got. But Hebrews would tell us, even just looking at this passage, that you cannot by yourself have access to God. You need that mediator between you and God. And that mediator is a high priest. But none of us fulfill all the qualifications of being a high priest. The one we least fulfill is being appointed by God in that position. And so if we do not qualify under those qualifications to be a high priest, we cannot bridge the gap between where we are and where God is. It's impossible. And so Hebrews would not allow us to do that because the qualifications for that role, they're beyond you and they're beyond me. We cannot deal with our own sin because we're caught inside it. We cannot appoint ourselves. Only God can open that door. And God has opened that door to one person and one person only. To Jesus. He has opened that door of high priesthood and that qualification, divine appointment, to one person and one person only, to Jesus. So if you do not come to Jesus and get into God's presence through Jesus, you are still in your sin and under the wrath of God, because you have rejected the only high priest that stands in the gap between you and God. Jesus has met every qualification you cannot meet and I cannot meet. He has gone where you cannot go. He has offered what you cannot offer. And he is already inside the Holy of Holies, appointed, qualified, authorized. And his offering for you still stands. This is beautiful. The referral has already been written. And as we'll see later, it's been written in his blood. Because Hebrews will make this point without apology. Where there is no shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. If there is no shedding, where there is no shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. And Jesus is the only one qualified to write your referral letter and to write mine. So may we come to grips with, and this is where we just need to sort of spend some time during the week. If we really want to understand what Jesus has done and how he was able to deal with your sin and deal with my sin, we have to take serious what the writer of Hebrews is saying, because he's dealing in depth with the fact that Jesus is a high priest. What does the high priest do? What is the high priest's function? The high priest's function, both in the Old Testament and in the fulfillment of Jesus, is to make possible how sin is dealt with and how a sinful people can come close to a holy God. If you remove the high priest from the equation, then God's judgment would fall. So if you remove Jesus out of his position of high priest, you and I have no standing before God. You will face his judgment, I will face his judgment. And we've got no case to make before him. None whatsoever. Let's pray. Jesus, I know that when we come to the rest of Hebrews, it's going to be so challenging to us. Because many of us, and how your word comes to us, and how we may have been used to receiving your word, has been in sound bites. It's been in really just cherry picking here and there. It's always been feel good. We see it so much, and we are confronted with it so often when we just look at any sort of video or clip from the internet. And we rarely take time to see how you are actually the fulfillment of the Old Testament, the sacrificial system. Everything that the Old Testament is about is actually just foreshadowing you. And may you give us the grace to give the time, to make the effort, and to sit with really what it means, Jesus, that you have saved us from our sin, and that you have dealt with our sin completely and decisively and that you will bring us into that freedom, Father, that we can understand what's going on underneath the hood. That when we speak about and say that Jesus saved me from my sin, that we will have such a deep and comprehensive understanding and appreciation of how you did it, Father, and how you have brought it about, that we will be the type of people that see Jesus for who he is, his superiority in all things, and that without him is that we do not have access to you. Without him, we cannot approach your throne with boldness. Without him, we are unable to draw near, and without him, we stand as people condemned before you. So Holy Spirit, may you continue to challenge us. May you continue to allow truth to rise in our hearts, to form us, to shape us. Help us to think about these things truthfully, honestly, sincerely, authentically. And Jesus, as we go into this week, may we go into this week with an absolute knowledge that you are our high priest and that you have fulfilled all the qualifications and more. And because of what you have done, that we have access to the Father. Because of what you have done, there no more remains a separation between us and him. And we pray this in your holy name. Amen. Amen.